The alarm started before I even reached the command floor. Red light spilled across every wall, and my boots slid on the polished tile as I turned the last corner. Through the tall window at the end of the hallway, I saw it. A ship the size of a small mountain hung above the Atlantic, blotting out the morning sun, casting a shadow that stretched across half the coastline. It had arrived 4 hours earlier. It had not fired a single shot. It did not need to. My name is Ethan Hale. At the time, I was a junior communications officer attached to the Earth Defense Coalition, stationed at the Central Command Hub outside Geneva. I was 26 years old, and until that morning, the most stressful part of my job was translating diplomatic cables between countries that still did not fully trust each other. That morning, everything changed. That morning, we stopped being a planet of separate nations, and we became a single, frightened species standing in the shadow of something we did not understand. I pushed through the doors into the command floor and found it packed wall to wall. Screens lined every surface, each one showing a different feed of the ship above the ocean. Generals from a dozen countries stood shoulder to shoulder, something that had never happened before in the history of our species, all staring at the same terrifying image. At the center of the room stood General Grace Whitfield, the coalition's ranking officer, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She caught my eye the moment I entered. "Hale," she said, "get to the translation desk, now." I did not ask questions. I moved. The message had come through 20 minutes earlier, broadcast on every frequency we used, and a few we did not even know we had. It was not spoken. It was not written in any human language. It arrived as a stream of light and sound that our systems slowly, painfully, converted into something we could read. I sat down at the terminal, and the words appeared on my screen, cold and clinical, as if they had been written by something that had never once considered whether we would be afraid. The message identified the ship as belonging to something called the Sylvani Council. It stated that Earth had been surveyed, cataloged, and classified. We were, according to their records, a Tier 9 unclassified species. I remember reading that line 3 times, trying to understand what it meant, before General Whitfield read it over my shoulder and said the words that would define the rest of my life. "It means they think we are property." The message continued. Tribute was required, resources, genetic samples, a labor allocation, whatever that meant, though none of us wanted to imagine it too closely. 30 days. If Earth did not comply, the message said, correction would follow. There was no explanation of what correction meant. There did not need to be one. The ship above us was answer enough. I remember the silence that followed as the room absorbed what had just happened. Somewhere behind me, a colonel from a country I will not name simply sat down on the floor, his legs no longer able to hold him. Another officer near the window began making calls, her voice shaking, trying to reach a family member before the lines became overloaded. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the words on the screen, feeling something I had never felt before. Not fear exactly, something colder, the sudden, total understanding that everything I had ever known, every border, every argument, every small human concern, had just become meaningless in the face of something vastly larger than us. For the next 6 hours, the command floor became a storm of activity. Leaders from every major nation connected through secure channels, their faces tired and pale on 100 different screens. I sat near the back of the room, listening, translating where I could, watching history happen in real time. Some leaders wanted to fight immediately, to launch every weapon we had at the ship above the ocean, as if we could somehow win through sheer desperation. Others wanted to comply, to buy time, to give the council whatever they asked for, and hope that mercy might follow obedience. I listened to men and women who had spent their entire careers competing against each other, suddenly forced to agree on something none of them wanted to agree on. There was no good option. There was only the illusion of choice. General Whitfield stood at the head of the table through all of it, saying very little, listening to everyone, her eyes moving constantly between the screens. I had worked under her for 2 years by that point, and I had never seen her look uncertain about anything. That day, for the first time, I saw doubt cross her face, quickly hidden, but there. It was somewhere near the 4th hour that a young scientist named Charlotte Reeves stood up from a side table where she had been quietly studying the ship's transmission patterns. She was not a soldier. She had been pulled in from a research post because she specialized in signal analysis, and she had spent the last several hours doing something none of the generals had thought to do. She had been studying not what the council said, but how they said it. "They are not expecting resistance," she said, and the room slowly turned to look at her. Every word in that message assumes compliance. There is no contingency language, no threat structure beyond the single word correction. "I think," she said, choosing her words carefully, "that they have never been refused before." That single observation changed the tone of the room entirely. If the council had never been refused, then refusal itself was an unknown variable to them. It would not fit their models. It would not fit their expectations. And an enemy without expectations is an enemy that can be surprised. I do not know exactly which leader first suggested it, because by that point, representatives from more than 40 countries were speaking over each other in 6 different languages. But somewhere in that noise, an idea took root and spread faster than any of us could have predicted. If we could not match the council's strength, we could deny them the one thing they clearly did not expect: compliance, fear, the quiet, obedient silence of a species that already believed itself beaten. By the 6th hour, the leaders had reached something close to agreement, an agreement built more on exhaustion and desperation than confidence. General Whitfield walked over to my desk and placed a single sheet of paper in front of me. On it were 3 words, typed in plain block letters, the kind of simple defiance that needed no translation and no explanation. "Come and see." I stared at the paper for a long moment. My hands were not entirely steady as I picked it up. "They want you to send this back," she said, "exactly as written. No greeting, no explanation, nothing else." "That's it?" I asked. "That's our entire response to an ultimatum from a species that can level a city from orbit?" "That's it," she said. I looked at her, searching her face for some sign that this was a mistake, that somewhere behind the scenes a smarter plan was still being built, that this was only a delay while the real answer took shape. I found no such sign. I found only a woman who had run out of easy options and had chosen the only kind of courage still available to her. "You understand what happens if this fails," I said quietly. It was not really a question. "I understand what happens if we kneel," she answered. "I would rather find out what happens if we do not." I sat there for a long moment with the paper in my hands, 3 simple words that were about to be broadcast toward a ship capable of ending human history without effort. I thought about my parents, still asleep in their home hours behind Geneva time, unaware that their son was about to send the most important message any human being had ever transmitted. I thought about every argument I had ever had about which country deserved more respect, which language mattered more, which border meant more than another. None of it had mattered even an hour ago. None of it mattered now. I typed the words into the transmission terminal. My finger hovered over the send command for a full 3 seconds, though it felt far longer. General Whitfield stood behind me, her hand resting lightly on the back of my chair, not to reassure me, I think, but because she needed something solid to hold on to as well. "Send it," she said. I pressed the button. The message left our world at the speed of light, climbing past the atmosphere, past the orbital stations that had gone dark and silent hours earlier, up toward the vast shape hanging above the Atlantic, like a verdict waiting to be delivered. I watched the transmission indicator on my screen until it confirmed delivery, and then I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the entire room could hear it. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. The ship above us did not move. No new message arrived. The silence stretched so long that I began to wonder if we had misunderstood something, if the Council's systems had simply failed to translate 3 simple words, if somehow humanity's entire fate now rested on a broken signal. Then the screens flickered, and a new transmission arrived, shorter than the first, almost confused in its brevity. It demanded clarification. It repeated the terms of the original ultimatum. It asked, in language that felt strangely uncertain for something so powerful, whether the response had been received correctly. We did not answer. I looked around the command floor and saw something in the faces of the people there that had not been present a few hours earlier. It was not confidence. Not exactly. We were still a fragile, outmatched species, standing beneath a sword we could not see the edge of. But there was something else now, something that had not existed in that room since the ship first appeared. A decision had been made. A line had been drawn. Whatever happened next, we had chosen to face it standing rather than kneeling, and there was a strange, quiet strength in that choice that I felt settle into my chest and stay there. General Whitfield finally spoke, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Now," she said, "we prepare." I did not know it yet, standing there with my hands still trembling slightly on the terminal, but those 3 words had already begun to change everything. Somewhere above us, a species that had never once been refused was recalculating everything it believed about the small, stubborn world beneath it. And somewhere deep inside myself, a quiet certainty was forming that I would carry through everything that followed. We were afraid, we were outmatched, but for the first time in human history, every nation on Earth had looked up at the same sky and decided, together, that we would not go quietly. The ship above the Atlantic did not leave. It simply waited, patient in the way only something vastly superior can afford to be, while far below, an entire planet began, quietly and desperately, to get ready for whatever came next. The Council's second ship arrived 9 days later, and it was smaller than the first, sleeker, built for something other than simple intimidation. I stood beside General Whitfield on the observation deck of our command bunker, buried 300 feet beneath what used to be a quiet stretch of countryside outside Geneva, and watched the sensor feed as it dropped out of the clouds over the eastern coastline. My chest tightened the moment I saw its shape. This was not a diplomatic vessel. This was a warship, and it had not come to talk. In the 9 days since I had sent those 3 words into the sky, the world had not slept. Every factory that could be repurposed had been repurposed. Every scientist who understood anything about energy shielding, propulsion, or weapons systems had been pulled from whatever project they had been working on and placed under a single unified command structure that, for the first time in human history, did not care what passport a person carried. I had spent those 9 days barely sleeping myself, moving between translation duties and coordination meetings, watching a species that had spent thousands of years fighting itself suddenly turn all of that energy in a single direction. Charlotte Reeves had become one of the most important people in the command structure almost overnight. Her early read on the Council's confusion had proven accurate in ways that kept surprising us. She had spent every waking hour studying fragments of Council technology recovered from a small probe that had crashed into the ocean during the first day of contact, apparently a scouting drone sent to observe our reaction. What she found gave us our first real understanding of who we were dealing with. "They are not soldiers," she told the command staff on the 6th day, standing in front of a screen covered in diagrams of alien circuitry. "Not in the way we think of soldiers. Their fleet does not train for resistance, because resistance essentially does not exist in their experience. Every species they have encountered has capitulated within the first contact window. Their weapons are built for overwhelming force delivered from a distance. Their ground forces, if they have any at all, are built for policing, not for combat against a species that fights back." "So they're bullies," said a colonel near the back of the room. "They're bullies who have never been hit," Charlotte replied. "There's a difference." That difference became the foundation of everything we built in the days that followed. We could not outgun the Council. Every simulation confirmed that a direct confrontation in open space or open sky would end badly for us within minutes. But if Charlotte was right, and every scrap of intercepted data suggested she was, then the Council's strength was built on an assumption of surrender. Take away the surrender, force them to fight on the ground, in cities and forests and mountains where their overwhelming firepower meant less, and their inexperience with actual combat meant more, and the equation might change. I remember sitting in on the strategy sessions during those 9 days and feeling a strange mixture of terror and something close to pride. Officers from countries that had been rivals for generations sat around the same table, arguing not about whose flag mattered more, but about how best to defend a coastline, how to hide supply lines from orbital scanning, how to turn the very geography of our planet into a weapon against an enemy that had only ever fought from above. General Whitfield ran those sessions with a quiet, relentless focus that held the entire coalition together, even as fear pressed in from every direction. The warship that arrived on the 9th day did not wait to negotiate. It descended toward a coastal region in the Eastern Hemisphere, and within an hour, a landing force began deploying from its underside, dozens of small transport craft dropping toward the ground like seeds scattered from a great dark flower. I watched the feed with my hands clenched at my sides, knowing that everything we had built in 9 frantic days was about to be tested against something none of us had ever truly faced before. The Council's ground forces, when they finally set foot on our world, moved with a strange, mechanical confidence, spreading out across the coastline in formations that looked almost ceremonial, as if they expected the local population to simply come forward and offer themselves without complaint. For a long, terrible moment, watching the feed from a reconnaissance drone hovering high above the scene, I wondered if that confidence was justified. I wondered if, when the moment actually arrived, courage would prove to be easier to declare in a command bunker than to demonstrate in the field. I did not have to wonder for long. The first coordinated human resistance came not from soldiers, but from a defense militia organized by local commanders who had spent the previous 9 days studying every inch of the coastal terrain. They did not meet the Council's forces head-on. They let them advance into a series of narrow valleys where orbital support could not easily distinguish friend from foe, where the thick tree cover disrupted their scanning equipment, and where a handful of well-placed defenders could hold a position that 100 advancing troops could not easily overwhelm. I listened to the radio traffic from that first engagement from 3,000 miles away, and I will never forget the tone in the voice of the young officer leading that defense, a steadiness that had not existed 9 days earlier, when we were all still strangers, hiding behind separate flags. The Council's forces, for all their advanced equipment, had never trained against an enemy that understood the ground it stood on. Their formations, built for policing frightened populations, faltered against ambush tactics drawn from centuries of human conflict, tactics that had been refined and passed down through generations of hard experience that the Council's own history simply did not contain. Within hours, the landing force that had descended with such calm confidence was pulling back toward its transports, its formation broken, its advance stalled. I remember the moment the first confirmed reports reached the command floor, the sudden, disbelieving silence that swept through the room before it broke into something between shock and quiet celebration. It was not a victory in any large sense. The Council's warship remained in orbit, untouched, and everyone in that room understood that a single stalled landing meant very little against a fleet capable of far greater force. But it meant something else, something that mattered more in that moment than any single battle. It meant the Council's confidence had been shaken for the first time in living memory, and confidence, once broken, is very hard to fully repair. General Whitfield allowed herself a rare, small smile as the reports came in, though she did not let the room celebrate for long. "They will not make that mistake twice," she said. "They will come back heavier next time, and they will not stop until they understand exactly what they are dealing with. We need to be ready for that, not comfortable with this." She was right, of course. 3 days later, a second, larger force descended, this time supported by heavier equipment and a far more cautious approach. The fighting that followed was harder, longer, and cost us more than the first engagement had. I spent those days moving between command centers, translating captured Council communications, coordinating with defense units across a dozen countries, running on too little sleep and too much coffee, watching the war unfold in fragments across 100 different screens. It was during this period that I met Oliver Bennett, a young transport pilot who had been flying supply runs into contested regions since the first day of the invasion. He came through the command bunker on a coordination visit, exhausted, his uniform still marked with dust from a landing strip somewhere near the coast, and he sat down across from me during a rare quiet moment with a tired but steady look in his eyes. "You're the one who sent the message," he said. It was not really a question. My involvement had become something of a quiet legend among the people fighting on the ground, though I never felt I deserved the attention. "I typed 3 words someone else wrote," I said. "That's all I did." "Someone had to press the button," he said. "I've flown over 3 of those valleys where our people held the line. I've seen what those 3 words bought us. Don't sell it short." I did not know how to answer him, so I simply nodded, and we sat together in silence for a while, 2 people from very different corners of a sudden, unexpected war, united by something neither of us had chosen, but both of us had accepted. The fighting continued for nearly 2 more weeks, spreading slowly to other regions as the Council, apparently unwilling to believe that a single coastline represented the full strength of human resistance, tested other landing sites around the globe. Each engagement taught us something new about their capabilities and their limits. Each engagement taught them, in turn, that the species they had classified as Tier 9 unclassified was not going to behave the way their models predicted. Charlotte Reeves continued her analysis throughout this period, and it was her work that gave us our first true strategic advantage. Studying patterns in Council communications intercepted during the fighting, she discovered that their command structure relied heavily on centralized coordination. Individual units received orders from a central authority aboard the main warship and rarely acted independently. It was, she explained, a system built for efficiency against compliant populations, but it created a serious vulnerability against an enemy capable of disrupting communication. "If we can interfere with their command signal, even briefly," she told the assembled command staff, "their ground forces lose coordination entirely. They are not trained to think for themselves in the field. They are trained to wait for instructions." Theo. This discovery reshaped our entire approach in the days that followed. Rather than simply defending territory, small specialized teams began targeting Council communication relays, brief, precise operations designed to create windows of confusion during which local defenders could gain ground or extract civilians from contested areas. I helped coordinate several of these operations from the command floor, translating intercepted signals in real time, feeding information to teams on the ground who were risking everything based on data I was reading only seconds before they acted on it. It was exhausting work, and frightening in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger and everything to do with the weight of responsibility. A mistranslation, a delayed report, a single missed detail, any of these could cost lives, and I felt that weight settle onto my shoulders more heavily with each passing day. General Whitfield noticed the toll it was taking on me during the 3rd week of fighting and pulled me aside after a particularly difficult coordination session. "You need rest," she said simply. "There isn't time," I answered. "There is never time," she said. "That is not the same as there being no need. A tired mind makes mistakes, Hale, and mistakes cost lives out there. Rest is not weakness, it is maintenance." I did not fully believe her in that moment, but I took her advice anyway, forcing myself to sleep for a few hours before returning to the terminal. It was a small thing, but it was also, I realized later, part of the larger truth that was slowly emerging from the chaos of those first weeks. We were not going to win this fight through raw strength alone. We were going to win it, if we won it at all, through discipline, coordination, and the willingness to care for each other even in the middle of a war that threatened to consume everything we had. By the end of the 3rd week, the Council's advance had stalled almost entirely. Their warship remained in orbit, its intentions unclear, and for the first time since the ultimatum had arrived, the fighting on the ground paused into an uneasy silence. I stood on the observation deck once more, staring up at the distant shape hanging in the sky, and felt a strange mixture of relief and dread settle over me. We had not won. We had only proven that we could not be easily taken. but somewhere far above us, I knew, the Council was recalculating everything it believed about the small, stubborn world it had once dismissed, with 3 casual sentences and a 30-day deadline. The silence, I suspected, would not last. And when it broke, I had a feeling it would break harder than anything we had faced so far. The silence lasted 11 days, and every one of those days felt heavier than the last. I have never experienced anything quite like waiting for an enemy you cannot see to decide your fate. The command bunker outside Geneva became a strange kind of home during that time, a place where soldiers, scientists, and translators like myself ate together, slept in shifts on cots lined along the walls, and watched the sky through a dozen different sensor feeds, waiting for the moment the Council's next move would begin. Charlotte Reeves spent those 11 days almost entirely without rest, poring over every fragment of intercepted data we had gathered during the first weeks of fighting. She built profiles of Council command patterns, mapped their communication relays, studied the weaknesses in their coordination systems with an intensity that both impressed and worried me. General Whitfield finally ordered her to sleep on the 9th day, the same way she had once ordered me, and Charlotte had argued just as I had, and lost just as I had. We are not going to win this by exhausting our own people before the real fight even starts, Whitfield told the room during a strategy session on the 10th day. The Council is patient because they believe patience costs them nothing. We need to be patient in a way that actually strengthens us. Her words proved prophetic, because what came on the 12th day was nothing like the earlier landings. There was no warning transmission, no ultimatum, no announcement. Sensor stations across 3 continents simply lit up at once, tracking dozens of Council vessels, descending through the atmosphere in a coordinated pattern that made it clear they had studied our earlier tactics and adjusted accordingly. This was not a probing action. This was a full commitment. I was at my station when the alert came through, and I remember the sudden sick drop in my stomach as I watched the tracking display fill with red markers, more than we had seen in any single engagement so far. General Whitfield's voice cut through the noise of the command floor, calm and steady, even as the scale of what we were facing became clear. All units, execute contingency formations. Communication teams, begin relay disruption on my mark. Hale, I need you on the Eastern Channel. They are broadcasting something, and I want to know what it says before our people have to guess. I pulled up the intercepted transmission and began working through the translation as quickly as I could, my hands moving across the console while the rest of the room dissolved into a controlled storm of activity around me. The message, when I finally rendered it into something readable, sent a cold chill through me. "This is not correction," I read aloud, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. "It says this is reclassification. They are not trying to punish us anymore. They are trying to remove the classification error entirely." The room went quiet for a moment as the weight of that translation settled over everyone present. "They think we are a mistake in their records," Charlotte said quietly from across the room, her voice barely above a whisper, "and they intend to correct their records permanently." There was no time to dwell on the implications. Reports began flooding in from every contested region, Council forces landing in numbers far beyond anything we had faced before, moving with a coordinated precision that suggested they had learned from every previous failure. The eastern coastline, the site of our first engagement weeks earlier, faced the heaviest assault, and it was there that I found myself pulled from the relative safety of the command bunker and sent forward to a regional coordination post. My translation skills needed closer to the actual fighting, where communication delays could no longer be tolerated. I will admit, without any shame, that I was terrified during the transport flight toward the coast. Oliver Bennett was the pilot, as it happened, a small and strange comfort in the middle of an increasingly chaotic situation. He glanced back at me once during the flight, reading the fear on my face easily enough. "First time this close to the front?" he asked. "First time anywhere close to the front," I admitted. "You'll be fine," he said, though I noticed his own hands were tighter on the controls than they had been during our earlier conversation weeks before. "Just do what you did before. Translate what you hear." Trust the people around you to do the rest. We landed at a coordination post built into what had once been a small coastal town, now converted into a defensive position with reinforced barriers and a small but dedicated staff working around the clock to manage the flow of information between the front lines and the central command structure. I was brought into a cramped operations room where a young captain named Lily Doyle was managing the local defense with a focus that reminded me of General Whitfield, though her exhaustion was far more visible. "Glad to have you," she said without pausing her work. "Their communication traffic has increased since the new landings began. I need a real-time read on their coordination signals. Our automated systems are struggling to keep up with the volume." I settled into a station beside her and began working, translating fragments of council communication as quickly as they came through, feeding the information to defense teams positioned throughout the town and the surrounding hills. The work demanded total concentration, and for a while, the fear I had felt during the flight faded into the background, replaced by the simple, focused urgency of trying to keep people alive with accurate information. The fighting that followed was the hardest I had witnessed since the war began. Council forces pushed into the town in far greater numbers than any previous engagement. Their coordination noticeably improved, their tactics adjusted to counter the ambush strategies that had worked so well in earlier weeks. I listened through my headset as defense units reported contact after contact, their voices tense but steady, drawing on training and experience that had been built over the previous month of hard fighting. It was during the third hour of the engagement that the coordination post itself came under direct threat. A council unit, moving faster than our forward observers had anticipated, broke through a defensive line on the eastern edge of the town and began advancing toward the very building where I sat, working alongside Captain Doyle and her small staff. I remember the moment the alert came through, the sudden shift in the room from focused urgency to something closer to raw fear, and the strange, disconnected way my mind processed the realization that I might not survive the next few minutes. "Everyone not directly essential to communications, fall back to the secondary position," Captain Doyle ordered, her voice sharp but controlled. "Hale, I need you here until the last possible moment. I cannot lose the translation feed during this." I stayed. I do not know if it was courage or simply the inability to think clearly enough to argue, but I stayed at my station, continuing to translate intercepted signals as the sound of the engagement grew closer outside the building. Through the small window near my station, I caught glimpses of movement in the street outside, defenders falling back toward our position in a controlled retreat, buying time for reinforcements to arrive from other sectors of the town. The next several minutes passed in a blur that I have never been able to fully reconstruct in my memory, even now. I remember the walls of the building shaking from something impacting nearby. I remember Captain Doyle shouting orders into her radio, coordinating a final defensive line just outside the post. I remember the strange calm that settled over me as I continued translating, some part of my mind deciding that the only thing I could actually control in that moment was the accuracy of the information passing through my hands. Reinforcements arrived just as the defensive line outside began to falter, a mobile unit that had been repositioned from a quieter sector of the town, moving fast enough to catch the advancing council force from an angle they had not anticipated. I heard the shift in radio traffic before I fully understood what it meant, the tension in the defenders' voices easing slightly as the immediate threat to the coordination post began to fade. Captain Doyle allowed herself a single deep breath before returning to the work in front of her, and I found myself doing the same, my hands trembling slightly as I continued the translation work that had, in some small way, helped hold that line. The engagement continued for another 6 hours before the council forces finally pulled back, their coordinated advance broken by a combination of local resistance, disrupted communication relays, and a stubborn refusal on the part of every human defender in that town to simply step aside. It was not a clean victory. We lost people that day, defenders I had listened to over the radio for hours, voices that simply went silent partway through the fighting and never returned. I did not know most of their names, but I felt each loss settle into me all the same, a weight that has never fully left me since. When the fighting finally quieted, I sat alone for a long while in the corner of the operations room, staring at my hands, trying to process everything that had happened. Captain Doyle found me there sometime later and sat down beside me without saying anything for a moment. "First real taste of it," she said eventually. "Yes," I admitted. "It doesn't get easier," she said, "but it does get more familiar. And familiarity, strange as it sounds, helps you function when it matters most." I did not fully understand what she meant in that moment, but I would come to understand it more fully in the weeks that followed, as the fighting continued to spread and intensify across multiple regions simultaneously. The Council, having failed to achieve a quick reclassification through overwhelming force, began adjusting their approach yet again, splitting their remaining forces into smaller, more mobile units designed to avoid the kind of large-scale engagements that had cost them so heavily. This shift created new challenges for our defense, but it also created new opportunities. Charlotte Reeves, working from the Central Command bunker, identified a pattern in the reduced coordination between these smaller council units, a vulnerability that stemmed from the very same rigid command structure that had made their larger forces so predictable in earlier engagements. Smaller units, operating with less centralized guidance, made more mistakes, hesitated more often, and proved far easier to isolate and outmaneuver than their larger counterparts had been. I returned to the Central Command bunker roughly 2 weeks after the engagement at the coastal town, exhausted but changed in ways I was still trying to understand. General Whitfield met me briefly upon my return, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and quiet respect that I had not expected. "I heard about the coordination post," she said. "Captain Doyle's report specifically mentioned your work under fire." "I just did my job," I said, echoing something Oliver had told me weeks earlier. "Everyone keeps saying that," Whitfield replied, "and every single time it turns out to have mattered more than the person saying it realizes." I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded and returned to my station, throwing myself back into the work, because it was the only thing that felt manageable in the middle of everything else. The war continued to grind on through the following weeks, a series of smaller engagements spread across the globe, each one costing both sides something, each one teaching us new lessons about an enemy that was clearly struggling to adapt to a species it had never expected to actually fight. It was during this period that I began to notice something shifting in the broader tone of the conflict, something that went beyond military tactics and touched something deeper in how humanity was beginning to see itself. Reports began arriving from research teams monitoring long-range communications, indicating that the Council's broadcasts to other regions of their territory had changed in tone, becoming less confident, more cautious, occasionally even defensive in their descriptions of the ongoing engagement with Earth. Charlotte Reeves brought one such intercepted transmission to the command staff during a briefing roughly 6 weeks into the fighting, her expression carrying a mixture of exhaustion and something close to hope. "They are no longer describing this as a correction action to their own command structure," she explained, pulling up the translated fragments on the main display. "They are describing it as a conflict, an active, ongoing conflict, with a species they classified as unable to resist. That distinction matters more than it might seem. It means somewhere in their own hierarchy, questions are being asked about how this happened." General Whitfield studied the translated fragments for a long moment before speaking. "Good," she said simply. "Let them ask questions. Every question is time we did not have to fight for. And every day we hold this line is a day closer to finding out exactly how far we can push before something finally breaks, either their patience or their confidence." I remember standing in that briefing room, surrounded by exhausted soldiers, scientists, and coordinators who had all given everything they had over the previous 6 weeks, and feeling something I had not expected to feel again after everything I had witnessed. Not comfort exactly, and certainly not safety, but a quiet, stubborn kind of hope, the same kind that had first taken root the moment 3 simple words left our world and climbed toward a ship that had expected only silence in return. We were still outmatched. We were still afraid. But we were no longer simply reacting. We were, slowly and painfully, beginning to shape the fight on our own terms. And somewhere above us, I knew, the Council was beginning to understand that the small, stubborn world they had once dismissed so easily was not going to be corrected, reclassified, or removed without a fight that would cost them more than they had ever imagined possible. By the third month of the war, I had stopped counting the names of people I had heard over the radio and never heard again. It was not that I stopped caring. It was that the number had grown too large to hold in my mind without breaking something inside myself, and I needed to keep functioning, because the work never stopped, and the people still fighting needed the information I could give them more than they needed my grief. The cost of those months was not something any of us could ignore, no matter how much progress we made against the Council's forces. Entire regions along contested coastlines had been damaged beyond easy recognition. Families had been displaced by the hundreds of thousands, moved inland to safer zones that grew more crowded with every passing week. I remember visiting one of these relocation centers during a brief assignment away from the command bunker, walking through rows of temporary shelters, watching children who had lost their homes playing games in the dirt, as if the world had not just changed forever around them. It was in moments like that, more than in any battle report or strategy session, that the true weight of what we were fighting for settled into me. General Whitfield never allowed the command staff to forget that weight, even as the pressure of coordinating a global defense consumed nearly every waking hour. She insisted on regular briefings that included not just military updates, but reports on civilian conditions, resource shortages, and the growing strain on infrastructure across every continent. I sat through many of these briefings feeling a strange mixture of pride and heartbreak, watching leaders who had once represented competing nations now working together not out of idealism, but out of the simple, brutal necessity of survival. "We are not fighting to win a war," Whitfield said during one such briefing, roughly 10 weeks into the conflict. "We are fighting to make sure there is still a world worth living in once this is over. Do not let the second goal disappear behind the first." It was around this time that Charlotte Reeves made the discovery that would ultimately reshape the entire direction of the war. Working with a small team of engineers, she had spent weeks studying the wreckage of a Council transport craft that had been disabled during an earlier engagement, salvaged largely intact from a forest region where it had crashed after losing power. What she found inside that wreckage was not a weapon or a piece of advanced technology, though there was plenty of that as well. It was a set of communication logs, damaged but partially recoverable, that revealed something none of us had expected. The Council was not alone in its territory. Other species existed within its sphere of influence, some willingly allied, others, according to fragments of the recovered data, held in something closer to the same tribute relationship the Council had originally tried to impose on Earth. Charlotte brought this discovery to General Whitfield and the rest of the command staff with an urgency I had not seen from her before, even during the most intense periods of fighting. "If this data is accurate," she explained, gesturing toward a star map projected above the briefing table, marked with symbols representing systems and species names our translation systems were still struggling to fully render, then Earth is not the first world to resist a tribute demand from the Council. We may simply be the first world to survive long enough for word of that resistance to spread. The implications of that discovery settled over the room slowly, and I watched as understanding dawned on the faces around the table one by one. If other species existed under similar pressure from the Council, and if word of Earth's continued resistance was somehow reaching them, then we were no longer fighting entirely alone, even if no ally had yet arrived to stand beside us. We were, perhaps, becoming a symbol, whether we wanted that role or not. General Whitfield authorized an immediate effort to attempt contact with any of the species referenced in the recovered communication logs, a difficult and uncertain task given the limitations of our understanding and our technology. Charlotte led that effort personally, working with a small team that included myself given my background in translation and communication analysis. It was slow, frustrating work, sending careful, deliberately non-threatening signals out into the void and waiting, often for days at a time, for any response at all. The first response came nearly 3 weeks after we began transmitting, faint and fragmented, but unmistakably intentional. It originated from a system several light years beyond the edge of what our instruments could clearly map, and the message, once painstakingly translated, was short but carried a weight that none of us fully anticipated. "We have heard of your refusal. We did not believe a world could refuse and survive." I remember the silence that fell over the small communications team as that message was read aloud for the first time. Charlotte's hands were shaking slightly as she prepared a response, and General Whitfield, who had joined us for this particular session, stood quietly at the back of the room, her expression carrying an intensity I had rarely seen from her. "Tell them the truth," Whitfield said finally. "Tell them it cost us everything we had to give, and we are still standing because we refused to give more than that." I helped craft that response, choosing words carefully, aware that whatever we sent would represent humanity to an audience far beyond our own world, an audience we barely understood and could not yet fully trust. The reply that eventually came back, days later, confirmed something that would prove critical in the months that followed. Other worlds were watching. Some were still too afraid to act openly against the Council, bound by tribute agreements they had accepted generations earlier and no longer believed they could escape. But some, emboldened by the mere fact of Earth's continued resistance, began offering quiet forms of support. Information about Council technology, warnings about troop movements gathered from their own limited surveillance networks, occasionally even small shipments of technology smuggled through routes the Council had not yet identified. This support did not win the war for us, not by any measure, but it shifted the balance in small, meaningful ways, giving our engineers new insights into Council technology that helped us develop countermeasures against their communication systems, giving our strategists advance warning of troop movements that had previously arrived without notice. I spent long hours during this period translating incoming transmissions from species I had never heard of, learning fragments of languages and cultures that existed entirely outside anything humanity had previously imagined, all while continuing to coordinate the ongoing defense of our own world. The Council, for its part, seemed to sense the shifting tide even before we fully understood it ourselves. Their tactics grew more aggressive through the 4th month of the conflict, their forces pushing harder against contested regions, their communications, when intercepted, carrying an increasingly urgent tone that Charlotte's analysis linked to growing pressure from within their own command structure. It seemed that news of Earth's continued resistance and the quiet support beginning to flow toward us from other worlds had not gone unnoticed by whatever authority stood above the Council itself. It was during this period of intensified fighting that I found myself once again pulled away from the relative safety of the Central Command bunker, sent this time to help coordinate a defense effort in a mountainous region that had become a critical point of contention due to a network of underground facilities humanity had begun using to shelter both civilians and essential production capacity. Oliver Bennett flew me in once again, and I noticed during that flight how much both of us had changed since our first conversation months earlier. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled either of us the way it once had. "You've gotten steadier," Oliver observed as we approached the mountain region, the terrain below marked with the scars of recent fighting. "So have you," I replied. "Steadier isn't the same as unafraid," he said. "I don't think that feeling ever really goes away. You just get better at working alongside it." The defense of the mountain region proved to be one of the longest and most difficult engagements of the entire war, stretching across nearly 2 weeks of continuous fighting as Council forces attempted repeatedly to breach the underground facilities that had become critical to human survival. I worked alongside a rotating team of translators and coordinators during that period, sleeping in short bursts between shifts, watching as defenders drew on every lesson learned over the previous months to hold a position that, by any reasonable measure, should not have been holdable against the forces arrayed against it. It was during the final days of that engagement that I witnessed something that has stayed with me ever since, a moment that captured, more clearly than any strategy briefing or intercepted transmission ever could, exactly what had changed in humanity since the day that ultimatum first arrived. A group of defenders, exhausted and low on supplies, had been cut off from the main defensive line during a particularly intense push by Council forces. Rather than retreating or requesting extraction, as would have been the reasonable choice, they held their position, buying critical time for civilians still being evacuated from a nearby facility, coordinating their defense through fragments of radio contact that I helped translate and relay from my station deep within the mountain. I do not know all of their names. I know that when the main defensive line finally pushed through to relieve them, every single one of those defenders was still standing, exhausted, injured in some cases, but unbroken. I know that the civilians they had protected reached safety because of the time that small, isolated group had bought with nothing but stubborn refusal to abandon their position. And I know that when I finally allowed myself to process what I had witnessed, sitting alone in a quiet corner of the underground facility, once the immediate crisis had passed, I felt something shift permanently inside myself, a full and complete understanding of exactly what those 3 words had come to mean. Come and see. We had told the Council to come and see what humanity was capable of, not fully understanding ourselves what that answer would demand of us. Months later, buried beneath a mountain that had nearly fallen to an enemy that once believed we would surrender without a fight, I finally understood the full weight of what we had shown them. Not strength in the way the Council understood strength, not overwhelming force or advanced technology, something older and, I had come to believe, far more difficult to overcome, a refusal to break, held together not by any single hero or brilliant strategy, but by an entire species finally choosing, together, to stand. The mountain held, the facilities remained secure, and somewhere far above us, I knew, the Council was beginning to understand that this war, the one they had started with a simple ultimatum and a 30-day deadline, was no longer a correction action they could simply walk away from without cost. It had become something else entirely, a conflict that was reshaping not just Earth, but the growing understanding of every world watching from the shadows of Council territory, quietly waiting to see how it would end. The final phase of the war began on a morning I remember, with a clarity that has never faded, even years later. It was the start of the 6th month since the Council's first ship had appeared above the Atlantic, and the command bunker outside Geneva had become something closer to a small city than a military installation, filled with personnel who had spent half a year learning to work together across every boundary that had once divided us. I was at my station when the alert came through, and unlike every previous alert during those long months, this one carried a different quality entirely, less chaotic, more deliberate. Sensor stations across the globe reported a massive gathering of Council vessels in high orbit, far more than had ever appeared at once during the entire conflict. For a long, tense hour, the command floor braced for what seemed like the final overwhelming assault we had feared since the very first day, the moment when the Council would finally commit everything it had to ending the resistance that had cost it so much more than expected. General Whitfield stood at the center of the room, her face carrying the same steady calm I had come to rely on throughout the war, though I could see the tension in the set of her shoulders as she studied the tracking display. "All defense networks, full readiness," she ordered. "If this is the final push, we meet it the same way we've met everything else. Together, and without giving them the surrender they've wanted from the very beginning." But the assault we braced for did not come. Instead, roughly 2 hours after the gathering began, a new transmission arrived, different in tone from anything we had received since that very first ultimatum. I sat at the translation terminal, my hands steady now in a way they had not been during that first transmission 6 months earlier, and worked through the message as it slowly rendered into readable language. It was not a demand. It was a request for direct contact, addressed not to a nation or a military structure, but to what the message called the representative authority of Earth. I read the words aloud to the assembled command staff, and for a moment, the room fell into a silence that felt entirely different from the fearful silence of 6 months before. This was the silence of disbelief, of cautious, uncertain hope. "They want to talk," Charlotte Reeves said quietly, reading over my shoulder. "After everything," said a colonel near the back of the room, "after everything we've lost, they want to talk." General Whitfield studied the message for a long moment before responding, her expression carefully controlled, though I could see something shift behind her eyes, a weight beginning to lift that had been pressing down on all of us for half a year. "Then we talk," she said. "But we talk from where we stand now, not from where we stood the day this began. Hale, I want you drafting the response personally. You sent the first message. It seems fitting you help shape this one as well." I will admit that my hands trembled slightly as I began working on that response, aware of the enormous weight resting on whatever words I chose. Charlotte worked alongside me, along with 2 other coordinators who had been with the effort to build outside communication with other worlds throughout the previous months, and together we crafted a message that reflected everything humanity had learned about itself during that long, difficult war. We did not offer surrender. We did not offer tribute. We offered something the Council, by every indication we had gathered, had never truly encountered before: a conditional willingness to speak as equals, backed by 6 months of evidence that we could not be simply corrected or reclassified without cost. The negotiations that followed took place over the course of nearly 2 weeks, conducted through a combination of direct transmission and, eventually, a carefully arranged meeting between a small human delegation and a representative of the Council aboard a neutral vessel positioned in high orbit. General Whitfield led that delegation personally, along with 2 other representatives selected through a process that, for the first time in human history, involved genuine cooperation between every major government on the planet. I was included as part of the communication support team, monitoring translations and providing real-time analysis from a secure channel linked to the meeting itself. The Council representative, when the meeting finally began, identified themselves through a title that our translation systems rendered as something close to overseer, a figure named Vareth Solane, who carried themselves with a formality that seemed to mask a deep and genuine uncertainty about the situation they now found themselves in. I listened through the secure channel as the initial exchanges unfolded, cautious and careful on both sides, neither party willing to reveal more than necessary, both parties clearly aware that the outcome of this meeting would shape far more than the immediate fate of a single world. It became clear, over the course of those early exchanges, that the pressure Charlotte had identified months earlier within the Council's own command structure had grown into something far more significant. Earth's continued resistance, combined with the quiet network of support that had grown between our world and other species living under Council influence, had created a situation the Council's leadership had never anticipated and clearly did not know how to fully manage. The Overseer's careful, formal language could not fully hide the underlying reality. The Council needed this conflict to end, and needed it to end in a way that did not further embolden the growing unrest spreading quietly through their wider territory. General Whitfield handled those negotiations with a steady, unshakable resolve that I have never seen matched before or since. She did not gloat over the position humanity now found itself in, despite everything we had endured to reach it. She did not make demands beyond what was reasonable and necessary, but she also did not yield an inch on the core principle that had guided every decision made since that first ultimatum arrived 6 months earlier. Earth would not be classified as tribute territory. Earth would not accept a relationship built on submission. Whatever agreement emerged from these negotiations would recognize humanity as something the Council had never expected to encounter, a species capable of standing as an equal, even against overwhelming odds. The final terms, when they were eventually reached, reflected a careful balance between the Council's need to save face within its own hierarchy and humanity's absolute refusal to accept anything resembling the original demand. Earth was formally reclassified, not as tribute territory, but as an independent, sovereign world, recognized under whatever loose framework of interstellar relations the Council maintained across its territory. No resources would be surrendered, no genetic samples would be provided, no labor allocation, whatever that grim phrase had originally meant, would ever be extracted from our world. I remember the moment the final agreement was confirmed, sitting in the communication support room deep within the neutral vessel, watching the translated text scroll across my screen, and feeling something break loose inside my chest that I had been holding tightly for 6 long months. I was not alone in that reaction. Around me, the small support team fell into a stunned, quiet celebration, careful not to disrupt the final formal exchanges still taking place in the main negotiation chamber, but unable to fully contain the relief and disbelief written across every face in the room. General Whitfield returned from that final session with an expression I had never seen on her before, exhausted beyond anything I had witnessed even during the hardest days of the fighting, but carrying something else beneath that exhaustion, a quiet, hard-won satisfaction that reflected everything humanity had sacrificed to reach this moment. "It's done," she said simply, addressing the small crowd that had gathered to hear the outcome directly from her. "They're leaving. All of them. Within 30 days, every Council vessel currently in our system will withdraw." The response to that announcement, when it reached the wider world in the hours that followed, was unlike anything I had ever witnessed or expected to witness again in my lifetime. I watched footage later, gathered from cities across every continent, of people pouring into streets that had been shadowed by fear for half a year, celebrating not a conquest, not a victory built on defeating an enemy, but simply the hard-won right to continue existing on their own terms. I thought of the families I had seen in the relocation centers months earlier, the children playing in the dirt beside temporary shelters, and I allowed myself, for the first time in 6 months, to fully believe that the world they would grow up in might actually be safe. The Council's withdrawal proceeded exactly as promised over the following weeks, their vessels departing our system one by one, the massive shape that had once hung above the Atlantic finally disappearing from our skies entirely on a quiet morning that felt, in its own way, more significant than any single battle fought during the previous 6 months. I stood on the same observation deck where I had first watched that ship arrive, though the bunker around me had changed considerably during the intervening months, and watched the final departure through a sensor feed that had once shown me nothing but fear, and now showed me something closer to closure. In the weeks that followed the Council's departure, humanity faced a new kind of challenge, one that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with rebuilding. The scars of the war remained visible across every continent, communities that had been damaged, families that had been displaced, and losses that no formal agreement could ever fully repair. General Whitfield remained at the center of the coalition structure that had formed during the crisis, working alongside leaders from every major nation to begin the long process of recovery, a process I suspected would take years, perhaps generations, to fully complete. But alongside that difficult work of rebuilding, something else began to emerge, something none of us had fully anticipated when the war began. The quiet contacts we had established with other species during the conflict, the worlds that had reached out cautiously during our darkest months, did not disappear once the immediate crisis ended. Instead, those contacts grew stronger, evolving from careful, uncertain exchanges into something closer to genuine communication between distant civilizations, each one curious about the small, stubborn world that had refused a tribute demand and survived. I found myself increasingly involved in these new diplomatic efforts, my experience translating both Council communications and the broader collection of languages we had encountered during the war, making me a valuable part of the growing effort to build relationships across the wider galaxy. It was strange, humbling work, learning to speak with civilizations that had existed for thousands of years, under systems and structures humanity had never imagined, listening to their own histories of struggle and survival, understanding that our own story, as significant as it felt to us, was only one small part of a much larger tapestry that stretched far beyond anything we had previously understood about our place in the universe. Charlotte Reeves went on to lead a newly formed research division focused entirely on understanding the wider network of worlds that had begun reaching out to us. Her early insights during the darkest days of the war having proven invaluable in ways that continued to shape humanity's growing understanding of its new place among the stars. Oliver Bennett remained a pilot, though his work shifted gradually from wartime supply runs to something closer to exploration, ferrying diplomatic missions and research teams to meet with representatives from worlds that had once been nothing more than fragments of intercepted data. I often think back to that first day, sitting at my terminal with 3 simple words on a sheet of paper in front of me, my hands trembling as I prepared to send a message that could have easily ended everything before it truly began. I did not fully understand in that moment what those words would demand of us, how much they would cost, or how completely they would reshape not just our world, but our understanding of everything beyond it. I only understood, in that fragile, frightened moment, that the alternative, quiet submission to a demand we had never agreed to and never deserved, was a cost I was not willing to accept, even if the fight that followed proved impossible to win. It did not prove impossible. It proved to be the hardest, costliest, most transformative 6 months in human history, a period that asked more of our species than we had ever been asked to give at once, and received, in return, something that no single nation or leader could have produced alone. A unity born not from shared comfort, but from shared struggle. A strength built not from advanced technology or overwhelming force, but from a simple, stubborn refusal to kneel. Standing now, years later, in a role that has taken me farther from home than I ever imagined possible during those frightened early days of the war, I still think often about General Whitfield's words on that very first day, when she placed 3 simple words in front of me and asked me to send them into the sky without knowing what would follow. "I would rather find out what happens if we do not kneel," she had said, and in the years since, I have come to understand that this simple, stubborn choice, made under the shadow of a ship that could have ended everything without effort, became the foundation of everything humanity has built since. We are still a young species among the wider community of worlds we have come to know since that war ended, still learning, still growing, still occasionally afraid of everything we do not yet understand about the vast and complicated universe surrounding us. But we are no longer a species defined by what we lack, by the gaps in our technology, or the limits of our reach among the stars. We are defined, instead, by what we proved during those 6 difficult months, and by the 3 words that started it all. Words that have since become something close to legend among the growing network of worlds we now call our neighbors, and in some cases, our friends. "Come and see," we told them, not fully understanding what those words would cost, or what they would ultimately prove. And when they came, and when they saw, they found something they had never encountered before across the whole of their territory, a small, stubborn, frightened world that chose, together, to stand rather than kneel, and in doing so, changed not only its own fate, but the quiet, careful calculations of every power that had once assumed the universe belonged only to the strong. The universe, as it turns out, belongs to whoever refuses to give up on it. And on a quiet morning 6 months after the first ship appeared above the Atlantic, humanity finally understood exactly what that meant, and has carried that understanding with us, out among the stars ever since.